For over 2,000 years, a carving inside an Egyptian temple has looked to modernize, unsettlingly like something it shouldn't be able to be. It has the shape of a bulb, a curved, snake-like form coiled inside it, a cable-like line trailing downward toward the ground, exactly where you'd expect a power source to sit if this were, somehow, a diagram of a light bulb carved 2,000 years before electricity was supposed to exist. According to reports, in 2026, this carving was run through visual analysis by Grok, the AI system built by Elon Musk's X AI, reigniting a debate that's been running since the 1960s. I can't independently verify the specifics of that particular AI analysis, since it would have happened after the point where I can reliably confirm current events, so I'll be upfront about that, rather than treating it as settled fact. What I can walk you through with full confidence is the actual carving itself, the genuinely fascinating history of the theory built around it, and the real, well-documented archaeological explanation that mainstream Egyptology has settled on, one that holds up considerably better than the version that tends to go viral. The carving in question is known as the Dendera Light, and it sits inside the Temple of Hathor, part of the larger Dendera temple complex on the western bank of the Nile, north of modern Luxor in Upper Egypt. The temple itself, dedicated to Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of love, music, fertility, and the heavens, is one of the best preserved ancient religious sites in the country, with reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions still legible in remarkable detail. Construction and decoration of the temple stretched across a long period, beginning under Ptolemaic rule, the Greek dynasty that governed Egypt following Alexander the Great's death, and continuing into the Roman era, with some of the crypt reliefs, including the one at the center of this story, dated to roughly the 1st century CE, during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. The carving itself sits inside one of the temple's crypts, small hidden chambers built into the temple's foundation, accessible only to priests and initiated religious officials, not to the general public. That detail matters more than it might seem at first, and we'll come back to it. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera is worth understanding a bit more fully, because its scale and preservation are exactly what allow this specific debate to keep being examined in such close detail centuries later. The site has been a place of religious significance for far longer than the current standing structure suggests, with evidence indicating earlier temples occupied the same location going back well over 1,000 years before the Ptolemaic and Roman-era buildings that survive today, following a pattern common across ancient Egyptian religious architecture, where new temples were regularly built directly on top of older revered sites considered sacred across many centuries. The temple complex that stands today includes not just the main sanctuary, but a network of surrounding chapels, a sacred lake, a birthhouse dedicated to celebrating the divine birth of Horus, and several sets of crypts built directly into the temple's substructure. Precisely the kind of restricted, purpose-built religious architecture where a civilization would store its most sacred symbolic imagery, meant for ongoing ritual use by trained priests rather than casual public display. The Ptolemaic period during which construction on this section of the temple began is itself a genuinely fascinating chapter of Egyptian history in its own right. Following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, his empire fractured among his generals, and one of them, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt, founding a dynasty of Greek-speaking pharaohs that would rule the country for roughly 3 centuries. Rather than imposing Greek religious practices wholesale, the Ptolemaic rulers made a deliberate, strategic choice to present themselves as legitimate successors within the existing Egyptian religious framework, funding and expanding traditional Egyptian temples, adopting pharaonic imagery and titles, and supporting the continuation of ancient Egyptian religious practice largely unchanged, even as Greek administrative and cultural influence spread through the country's cities. This is exactly why a temple built and decorated during a period of significant Greek political control still displays thoroughly, unmistakably, Egyptian religious iconography and mythology throughout, since Dendera, and temples like it, functioned as active centers of specifically Egyptian religious continuity, carefully maintained across a period of substantial foreign rule. Visually, it's easy to see why this image captured public imagination the moment photographs of it started circulating widely. The relief depicts a large, elongated oval shape, wider in the middle and tapering at both ends, with a serpentine curving form inside it. Below the oval, a line extends downward that some observers have read as a cable or cord. Figures stand around the object, one appearing to support it, another positioned nearby in what looks like a ritual gesture. To eyes accustomed to 20th century electrical equipment, the resemblance to a glass bulb with a glowing filament inside, wired to a power source, is genuinely striking on first glance. That resemblance is exactly what caught the attention of a Norwegian electrical engineer in the 1960s, who was among the first to formally propose that the carving depicted an ancient electrical device rather than a religious symbol. The idea gained a much wider audience later when Austrian authors Peter Krasse and Rainer Habeck published a book on the theory. arguing that the relief showed a form of ancient lighting technology, comparing it specifically to a Crookes tube, an early experimental device developed by physicist William Crookes in the late 19th century, which does produce a glowing effect inside a glass envelope using an electrical current. This theory didn't emerge in a vacuum, and understanding its broader cultural context helps explain why it caught on so quickly and has proven so durable in popular imagination ever since. The 1960s and 1970s saw a genuine explosion of what's often called ancient astronaut theory and alternative history more broadly, popularized enormously by books like Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods, published in 1968, which proposed that numerous ancient monuments and artworks across different civilizations, from the pyramids to Nazca lines to various Mesoamerican structures, actually depicted or were influenced by extraterrestrial visitors possessing advanced technology. This genre found an enthusiastic audience partly because it emerged during an era of genuine, rapid technological transformation, the height of the space race. The first moon landing in 1969, a period when audiences were primed to imagine that ancient civilizations might have brushed against forces or knowledge beyond conventional historical understanding. The Dendera Light theory fits comfortably within this same broader cultural moment and movement, sharing its basic structural logic. Identify a visual resemblance between an ancient artifact and modern technology. Then propose that resemblance as evidence of forgotten advanced knowledge, generally without requiring the kind of corroborating physical evidence that would normally be needed to support such a significant historical claim. Proponents of this theory built their case around a few specific visual comparisons: the oval shape resembling the glass envelope of a Crookes tube, the snake-like form inside representing a filament or an internal electrical discharge, the line beneath the oval representing a cable bringing in current, a separate symbol appearing nearby in some versions of the relief, called a D-Jed pillar, a genuinely ancient and common Egyptian religious symbol associated with stability and the god Osiris, was proposed by some theory advocates as a kind of insulator, protecting whoever operated the device. Here's where it's worth being clear and specific about why mainstream Egyptology has never accepted this reading, because the reasons aren't dismissive or hand-wavy. They're grounded in exactly the kind of physical and textual evidence that actually settles archaeological questions. First, and most simply, there is no supporting physical evidence anywhere in Egypt for electrical technology of any kind from this period. No wiring, no batteries, no sockets, fixtures, or fragments of glass consistent with bulbs. Archaeological excavation across Egypt has been extensive and ongoing for well over a century, and materials like copper wiring or glass fragments are exactly the kind of durable evidence that does survive burial for millennia and does get found when it exists, as it has at countless other ancient sites for far more mundane technologies. Its complete absence here isn't a gap in the research. It's a genuinely meaningful negative result. Second, and this is the detail that tends to get skipped over in the more sensational retellings, the hieroglyphic inscriptions carved directly alongside this relief are not ambiguous. They explicitly reference Egyptian religious and mythological concepts, not technical or mechanical ones. When Egyptologists studied the full context of the crypt carving, rather than just the central image in isolation, the accompanying text, along with closely related imagery, found elsewhere in Egyptian temples and religious art from other periods, points clearly and consistently toward a specific, well-documented mythological scene, a lotus flower, one of the most sacred symbols in Egyptian religious art, representing creation, rebirth, and the sun's daily emergence, giving rise to a serpent form associated with the deity Harsamtis, a god linked to the sun god Ra, and the concept of divine light emerging from primordial waters at the moment of creation. The oval shape in this well-supported reading isn't a glass bulb at all, but a lotus blossom, and in some interpretations connects to broader imagery of Nut, the sky goddess, whose body was often depicted arched protectively over the world in Egyptian cosmology. This exact combination of lotus, serpent, and creation symbolism appears elsewhere in Egyptian religious art with much clearer, less ambiguous context, which is part of why Egyptologists recognize this specific scene so confidently rather than treating it as a unique, unexplained anomaly. To understand why this particular mythological combination made such intuitive sense to ancient Egyptian religious thinkers, it helps to understand the broader creation narrative it's drawing from. In one of several overlapping Egyptian creation accounts, the world begins as an endless expanse of dark, undifferentiated water, personified as the god Nun. From within these primordial waters, a lotus flower rises and opens at the first dawn, and from within that opening flower emerges the sun itself, or in some versions of the myth, a divine child associated with the sun god, marking the very first sunrise and the beginning of ordered existence. This is precisely the kind of foundational religious narrative Egyptian temples were built to memorialize and reenact ritually, and it explains why lotus imagery appears so extensively across Egyptian religious art and architecture more broadly, not just in this one crypt at Dendera. Column capitals throughout Egyptian temple architecture were frequently carved in the shape of lotus buds or fully opened lotus blossoms. Tomb paintings regularly depict the deceased holding or smelling a lotus flower, symbolizing rebirth into the afterlife. The lotus's own natural behavior, closing each evening and sinking beneath the water's surface only to rise back up and reopen at the following dawn, made it an unusually perfect natural symbol for the Egyptians' own religious preoccupation with daily solar rebirth and the promise of resurrection after death. The connection ancient Egyptian priests would have found immediately obvious and meaningful in a way that requires no leap of interpretation at all. The serpent imagery similarly carries a long, well-documented history throughout Egyptian religious art that has nothing to do with electrical filaments. Serpents appear constantly throughout Egyptian mythology in multiple, sometimes contradictory symbolic roles, sometimes representing chaos and danger, as with the serpent Apep, who threatened the sun, God's nightly journey through the underworld, but just as often representing protection, regeneration, and royal divine authority, as with the uraeus, the rearing cobra symbol worn on the crowns of pharaohs, specifically to represent divine protection and legitimate rulership. The specific serpent associated with Harsamtis in this creation context represents this second protective and regenerative symbolic tradition, tied specifically to the emergence of ordered divine light from primordial chaos, which is exactly the thematic content the surrounding hieroglyphic text at Dendera actually describes. Third, the location itself argues strongly against a technological reading. This carving sits inside a sacred restricted crypt, a space reserved specifically for priestly ritual, not public demonstration or technical instruction. If this were genuinely a diagram documenting a working electrical device, its placement inside the most religiously restricted, ritually significant part of the temple, surrounded specifically by creation mythology text, would be a strange and impractical choice. Every other piece of context around the carving, its placement, its accompanying inscriptions, its stylistic parallels elsewhere in Egyptian religious art, points toward the same conclusion. This is a carefully executed piece of religious cosmology, not a technical schematic. It's also worth addressing directly a related artifact that sometimes gets pulled into this same conversation for extra support, the so-called Baghdad battery, a set of ceramic and metal components discovered near Baghdad in the 1930s by German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig, sometimes proposed as evidence that ancient civilizations in this broader region had working battery technology, dating to somewhere around the Parthian or Sassanid period, roughly 2,000 years ago. It's worth being precise here, too. The Baghdad battery is a genuinely real, disputed archaeological artifact, a small clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, and Koenig himself proposed in the 1930s that it might have functioned as a simple galvanic cell, capable of producing a small electrical charge, if filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine. Some later experiments have shown that a replica of the object, when filled with such a liquid, can indeed generate a very weak electrical current, which is the main piece of evidence cited by supporters of the battery theory. But most archaeologists and historians who've studied the object in its full context believe this explanation doesn't hold up well, since there's no evidence anywhere in the surrounding region from that era of anything the small current could have plausibly powered. No wiring, no electroplated objects definitively linked to the technique, and no supporting textual references to such a device anywhere in the substantial written record surviving from that period and region. The leading alternative explanations, considered more plausible by most specialists, suggest the object was likely used for something considerably more mundane, such as storing a rolled papyrus or a leather scroll, a purpose consistent with similar jar and rod artifacts found elsewhere from the same general era, or possibly playing some role in a metalworking or electroplating process, unrelated to standalone electrical power generation. It's a separate object from a different culture and time period entirely, and most archaeologists who've studied it believe it was far more likely used for something like storing sacred scrolls, or in a limited metalworking application, not confirmed to have functioned as a standalone battery in the dramatic way popular retellings often assert. Using one unresolved, disputed artifact from Parthian-era Iraq to prop up an unrelated theory about a completely different carving, from a different country, a different culture, and a different era entirely, is exactly the kind of reasoning that doesn't hold up well once you look closely at each piece individually, rather than treating them as a connected body of evidence. So where does that leave the framing of an AI system examining this carving and reportedly finding something that reopened the debate? Here's the honest, useful way to think about that, regardless of the specific details of any one particular analysis. A visual pattern recognition system, however sophisticated, examining a photograph of a carving, can genuinely identify real things. geometric precision, deliberate proportional relationships, evidence of careful, intentional craftsmanship, rather than careless or random decoration. Ancient Egyptian priests and artisans were, in fact, extraordinarily skilled at exactly this kind of deliberate, mathematically considered design, a skill reflected throughout Egyptian architecture and religious art more broadly, from temple layouts to hieroglyphic composition. Finding evidence of intentional, careful design in this carving would be a genuinely unsurprising and entirely expected result, fully consistent with the religious interpretation Egyptologists have already established, not evidence against it. What a visual analysis tool fundamentally cannot do, no matter how sophisticated, is determine intent or meaning from shape alone, separate from historical, textual, and archaeological context. Identifying that two objects share a similar silhouette doesn't establish that they share a similar function, particularly when one of those objects sits inside a body of well-documented religious inscriptions, an iconographic tradition that already explains it thoroughly, and the other exists in a civilization with zero corroborating physical evidence for the technology being proposed. This is a genuinely important distinction in how any pattern matching system, human or artificial, should be weighed against direct textual and material evidence. And it's exactly the standard mainstream Egyptology has consistently applied to this specific carving for decades. Identifying that two objects share a similar silhouette doesn't establish that they share a similar function, particularly when one of those objects sits inside a body of well-documented religious inscriptions, an iconographic tradition that already explains it thoroughly, and the other exists in a civilization with zero corroborating physical evidence for the technology being proposed. This is a genuinely important distinction in how any pattern matching system, human or artificial, should be weighed against direct textual and material evidence. And it's exactly the standard mainstream Egyptology has consistently applied to this specific carving for decades. This distinction actually matters well beyond this one carving, because it points to a broader, genuinely useful lesson about how image analysis AI tools should and shouldn't be used in serious historical research going forward. These systems are, in a very real sense, sophisticated pattern matching engines trained on enormous data sets to recognize visual similarity, symmetry, and structural regularity with a level of speed and precision no human researcher working by eye alone could match. That capability has genuine, legitimate archaeological value for tasks like comparing thousands of pottery shards for stylistic groupings or detecting subtle structural anomalies in a large excavation site faster than a team could by hand. But visual similarity to a modern object is a fundamentally different kind of evidence than corroborated historical and material context, and conflating the two, treating "this looks like a light bulb" as equivalent evidence to "this appears alongside inscriptions explicitly," describing a creation myth in a location consistent with known religious practice, with zero supporting physical technology found anywhere in the surrounding archaeological record, risks getting the entire hierarchy of evidence backwards. Any serious use of AI in archaeology going forward will need to treat pattern recognition as a tool for generating leads worth investigating further, not as a substitute for the actual textual, material, and contextual evidence that ultimately has to settle a historical question. None of this makes the Dendera Light any less remarkable as an object worth understanding. A goddess arching protectively over the sky, and wove those observations into a sophisticated, symbolically dense visual language capable of encoding an entire creation narrative into a single carved relief, precise enough in its execution that modern viewers, seeing it without that context, mistake careful religious symbolism for something else entirely. That confusion isn't a flaw in the ancient artisans' work. It's arguably a testament to how carefully and deliberately they built it. The Dendera Light has endured for 2,000 years specifically because it was made to last, to communicate something sacred and permanent to those who understood its symbolic language. It just happens that, to modern eyes, untrained in that specific visual vocabulary, and primed by over a century of electrical technology, shaping what a bulb and filament shape means to us instinctively, it reads as something else entirely. A reminder that the assumptions we bring to an ancient image shape what we see in it just as powerfully as the image itself does. If getting the real, well-documented story behind ancient mysteries that keep getting reframed as something more sensational is what you're here for, subscribe. Because there's always a genuinely fascinating explanation sitting right there in the historical record if you're willing to look past the more exciting headline first.